Welcome to video lecture number 2. This one is going to cover the Code of Intellectual Conduct, which is right here, Code of Intellectual Conduct. And I'm going to just talk through some of the principles on the code and flesh them out a little bit more than how they're already there. Some of them I think actually need to be adjusted a little bit. I'm not in complete agreement with it. Remember, my kind of intention for the code for our class is that we treat it like a contract, like something that we're going to agree to follow as much as we can. We can't promise that we will follow it, but we can promise that we'll try to follow it to the extent that we're capable of. And if I'm thinking about this as a contract of like governing my behavior in a critical debate, given the kinds of set goals and objectives that the code is setting for itself about what we want to accomplish in a discussion like that, I actually think that the code needs a little bit more. It needs some help. And it needs some adjustments. So I'm going to share those with you as I go through the principles, but I also recommend that you think about them critically for yourself too, and talk to me about any modifications you would want to make. I'm going to see you, the whole class, next time we see each other is on Monday. So maybe on Monday we can talk about that a little bit more before going on with the rest of our material. So you can bring up any objections or whatever that you have. So let's start here with the code. Let's look at this first part here before we actually get to the principles. Is talking about these standards for the code itself, this procedural standard and this ethical standard. These are kind of telling us what are the success conditions for the code itself. Like, how would we know what rules would be good rules and which ones would be bad rules? The most kind of direct thing that we would like out of a intellectual debate is hopefully that we'd be able to discover what the truth is. And you'll notice there on the procedural standard, it says the rules that, when followed, most often lead to 1, the successful resolution of issues, 2, the most rationally endorsed beliefs, and we hope 3, the truth. Now, actually, I kind of put that in reverse order. Maybe you've heard of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is a famous Eastern philosophy text, and it has all sorts of great wisdom and advice in it. And it's kind of written in a poetic style, and it has these wonderful little passages where it says something like, the ideal would be this. This is like whatever the topic is, whatever, like a virtue or a value, something like that, or some kind of goal or purpose that we'd want to fulfill in life. Or like the best version of it would be this. This would be perfection, to live this way. But if that can't happen, then the next best thing would be this. So if like pragmatic circumstances get in the way, or you've got certain personal difficulties that makes this like highest ideal of perfection impossible, then the next best thing to shoot for is this, and then the next best thing, and the next best thing, all the way down. And then usually at the bottom is what like common sense tells you. That's how it usually works. And that's what this part of the code is kind of doing as well. That the first thing we want is the truth. If we can we can set some kind of parameters for how we're going to engage in this debate that's going to give us the best shot at getting at the truth. We'd love that. That's the main ideal. That'd be perfection right there, getting at the truth. But hopefully by the end of this quarter, you'll see, and you probably already have some experience with this already, that if you're trying to get at the truth, it's pretty hard to do it. And in some cases, you might not have any confidence that you actually are going to be able to achieve that. You actually get at what's really true, or have the confidence that the speculations that we formed are actually the case. So maybe the truth is not possible. There's also a bunch of philosophical perspectives that are pretty fatalistic about even the existence of truth. Whether there is even such a thing out there, like universal objective truth. Is there such a thing? That itself is a philosophical debate. So there might be some serious concerns about whether or not we can even know anything at all. So it might not be a matter of truth, but also our ability to get at it. So these are so-called skeptical philosophical perspectives. Perspectives that entail that we're really not in a position to know much of anything. The resources we have available the evidence that we have available doesn't give us enough to really know a lot. We're going to look at some of those perspectives in this class during the quarter. But for right now, we can just kind of acknowledge that sometimes truth is hard to get at. So what do we do if truth is impossible? Well, the code is saying there's next best thing, the most rationally endorsed beliefs. So even if following these principles won't get us to the truth, maybe they'll get us to those beliefs or conclusions or perspectives or positions that have the most going for them rationally. They're the ones that have the most justification backing them up. And maybe even that we're not going to be able to get consensus on that either. We're not going to be able to have confidence that, yep, this position, this perspective, way better than this other perspective. So if we can't get at the most rationally endorsed beliefs, well, we're still not out of luck here, because we could still get at this sort of successful resolution of issues. Think about this as like adjudicating disagreement. That if I'm just trying to figure out a way to get two people who are not going to agree to just get along with each other, like find some way to like mediate that disagreement. The code is saying that if it's doing a good job, these are rules that are also going to help with that project. All right, I've got a comment here. This is going to be kind of awkward, like stopping the lecture, whatever. I guess that's just how my lectures normally are in class, but this is so new to me. It feels so weird. All right, let's see. In my personal philosophy, I often defeat my own arguments because I am ultimately led to reject the idea of universal truth. Should I argue something different? Well, here's the funny thing about the dismissal of universal truth. If universal truth goes out the window, then you can't actually refute anything. So if you're going to make an objection to some position, you have to make some positive claims. Say I want to attack this position or make some kind of objection. I need a platform from which to do that. If there's no universal truth, then the claims that I'm making to make the objection are just as not universal as the claims that are getting attacked. So the objection wouldn't count objectively as an objection either. So losing out on universal truth makes pretty much everything we want to do rationally impossible, which still could mean that that's the right, that could still be reality. It might work that way. Maybe rationality is an illusion too, but it's pretty drastic. If you're talking about just wanting to kind of hold both sides of a debate, or sort of recognize that maybe both sides have complications, or they don't have perfect positions, or they're both open to objection, that is still possible and compatible with the belief in universal truth. So that can still happen. I can believe that there's universal truth without knowing what exactly it is. So I think sometimes we think like, well, if you believe that there is a universal truth, then you believe that we're capable of getting it, like we're able to hold it in our hands. But that's not necessarily the case. It might not happen that way. All right, sorry for that brief pause. I was just getting some more people into the chat room. Okay, so we were talking about these different sort of tiered goals of or ambitions that the code has for itself. That it wants to be the set of rules that are going to get us to the truth, hopefully. And if we can't get at the truth, the most defensible position. If we can't get the most defensible position, then at least we might be able to successfully resolve disagreements. Now, I think that that's something kind of crazy cool about the Code of Intellectual Conduct, and the reason why I think that that it is something special about it, that it's able to do all those things, if it can, is that I think it's tempting to think that there's like one set of rules for like high-minded idealism, like getting at the truth sort of thing, and then there's another set of rules that's like pragmatic life, like how to get around in the world, how to like make stuff happen, that may not care that much about ideals or truth, and that the rules for these are different. That it's one thing to like sit in your ivory tower and contemplate philosophy, and then there's another thing to like figure out what works, like where the rubber meets the road. I got to make decisions. I have to have beliefs that let me do things that I want to do in the world. And if the code is correct, then it's saying that really those are the same things. The rules are the same in both domains. That what works at this level of the highest ideal is the same as what happens with the most like grounded, rubber meets the road kind of realism arena too. That's I think something noteworthy. So I wanted to point it out, make note of it. The second standard that the code holds itself to is this ethical standard, which says that it's the rule that's trying to be the set of rules that, when followed, constrain our behavior within context of disagreement in light of what we owe to others and to ourselves. In other words, that these rules describe the best way to be and behave in a certain sphere of human life. And this is, I've kind of been alluding to some of this ethical component. I was talking in class today about all the things, the anxieties that getting into this like critical debate space might do, or might provoke, or make you nervous about, um, and uh, and that's kind of part of the ethical sensitivity to engaging in intellectual debate or discussion, is to recognize that there's ways in which we can pursue the truth that are going to be harmful to other people, like we were talking about abusive practices this morning, like being a jerk and insulting people and calling them dumb and stuff, or silencing them. Those are really big problems. But also there's ways that you can harm yourself in the process too. And we just want to kind of be attentive to that and keep that on our radar while we're trying to pursue the truth. I think I mentioned this morning that I've met a lot of philosophers who I think are extremely sincere in that when they're in a debate, they're not trying to win, they're not trying to just destroy everyone around them, they're really just trying to get at the truth. But because they're kind of insensitive about how they're going about that, they don't realize that their way of proceeding can be hurting people's feelings and that sort of thing. Now, what this doesn't mean is that we should like compromise the truth in order to like make people feel okay and stuff like that. That's not the point of what it's saying, but it is saying that the truth is not the only thing that matters here, and I think that's fair. That there's definitely more. There are other important things in life other than just whether you've got the truth or not. And even if you have the truth, it doesn't mean that whatever you're going to do with it is licensed and justified and appropriate. There's plenty of examples of human behavior on this planet where people have thought that their actions were justified pretty much on the ground that they were right, and not recognizing that there are other ethical considerations there about proper conduct. So the code is acknowledging that, and there's a lot of crossover here between um, these considerations about how we're going to get the best shot at getting at the truth, and considerations about how we can treat each other properly. One thing that is important here, but I like to emphasize, is that treating people properly doesn't necessarily mean being nice or making sure people don't feel uncomfortable or something like that. I think there's kind of two sources of discomfort in engaging in critical debate. One of them is natural. Like these sources of discomfort are natural to just the activity of having your beliefs attacked, your perspectives assaulted by objection, being challenged, having to stick your neck out there and say this is what I believe and this is what I stand for, and put a big target on your chest. That itself is pretty dangerous. It's also scary that like maybe if your ideas and beliefs and values don't win in the debate, you might have to sort of be compelled to give them up, and you might be attached to them. You might be like, I don't want to give them up. I don't want to have to be like, oh man, I guess they are false. Crap. Well, I'll have to kind of drop them, or I look like a big hypocrite, right? Or I am a hypocrite, something like that. So that can be scary too. So those are natural sources of anxiety, like the kind of stuff I was mentioning this morning. I think there's not much we can do about that other than to try to support each other through that like difficult activity, and respect and understand that it's difficult and have some patience for it and that sort of thing. But then there's a lot of other things that we do when we argue with each other that makes things unnecessarily anxiety provoking to an extreme degree. Like it's just ridiculous, silly, stupid stuff that we could easily avoid doing if people just like didn't, even something as simple as like not raising the tone of your voice, or not getting all like or something like that. Like it's pretty easy to avoid those kinds of anxiety sources that are just going to make things needlessly complicated. That kind of behavior, insulting people, doesn't get us anywhere nearer to the truth. It's not like, well, our best shot at getting at the truth is this situation where we just verbally abuse each other the whole time. That's not going to be helpful. You do need to attack people's positions. Got to be critical. There's this like listening and being critical. Both things I think are important for respect, like I've been talking about in class this week. But certainly there's a good way to do that, a respectful way to do that, and a abusive way to do that. We want to avoid the abusive stuff. So that helps a little bit with the discounting. Okay, so that's the basic framework for the code. Are those standards? I'm gonna pause it here for a second. All right, so that's a basic framework for the code. If we don't like the principles on the code, if we think that we should maybe make some adjustments to them, it'll come down to whether there's a different set of rules that would be able to accomplish these goals for us. So these are kind of the core to what we're trying to pledge to each other. We're going to have a debate in this class. We're going to have any discussion. We want to try to get at the truth. That's got to be that's our hope, is that we're going to, in discussing things, get closer to the truth. And in the process of doing that, in the process of pursuing that end, we don't want to use means that are going to be harmful and abusive and violate these ethical considerations. All right, so let's start looking at the principles themselves. So I talk about this like table of the debate. Like, imagine like we come to the table, we have a little debate, and then we leave, sort of thing. And there's principles that are for like each phase there of the like coming to the table, what we do when we're at the table, and then how we kind of dismount from the debate, how we leave the table. And the first couple principles are for how we approach the table of the debate. So I'll read them to you. I actually want to skip the fallibility principle. We'll do that one next, but first let's do the truth-seeking principle, which says that each participant should be committed to the task of earnestly searching for the truth, or at least the most defensible position on the issue at stake. Therefore, one should be willing to examine alternative positions seriously, look for insights in the positions of others, and allow other participants to present arguments of or raise objections to any position held on an issue. What this basically comes down to is that if one of the stated goals for the Code of Intellectual Conduct is to find principles that constrain our behavior in such a way that we got the best shot at getting at the truth, well, one principle that really helps to make our discussion have any shot at getting at the truth is if everyone who's involved in that discussion has that as their goal. So basically, imagine something else. Imagine if people had some other purpose or intention or ambition in the conversation activity. So they want to be right, or they want to win the debate. Or I always love I love it when there's a presidential election coming up, because they have the like live televised debate sort of thing, and those are such great examples. It provides a wealth of examples for illustrating all these principles on the code. And in a presidential debate, the debate that they're having is not aimed at getting at the truth. It's not like, hey, these are two candidates for president. They're both probably pretty smart people. They probably have good ideas. Let's let them debate things, and then we'll figure out what's good for the country. It's not usually what happens, or at least that's not why those presidential candidates agreed to show up on television and have that discussion. The reason they're doing that is why. People in the chat. You want to answer? I don't know. I'm so used to asking questions and stuff in lecture too. Yeah, well, yeah, to win. That's right. But win something for their campaign. Win votes, right? That's their purpose. They're like, if I can make this other guy look stupid, then I can get more votes. And even yeah, there you go. Yeah, you guys are all, that's all right. Sometimes I'm like, why the hell would you ever run for president? I'm like, what kind of motive does it take? I don't know. It's crazy. But anyway, even the political analysts after the debate are like talking about the zingers and stuff. Like, the focus is not really on the strength of the arguments or whether what they're defending is true. It's all about this like rhetorical show. When participants in a debate have some goal other than getting at the truth, then that's what you get. I mean, you don't get the truth. That's the result. So if people were doing that, then there's a better chance that we're going to actually achieve the truth. That's what the truth-seeking principles say. Not too crazy. There are also some other things that are probably worth picking out, because like the examples that I just used are kind of like obvious ones. But here's a good example of one that you might not think of right away. Let's say my ambition for the debate is that no one's feelings get hurt. That also might hurt our ability to get at the truth. If I'm just trying to like protect everyone's ego, and that's my concern, then as we try to discuss this topic, we don't have the best shot at getting at the truth. Sometimes, I mean, I've experienced this even with hanging out with close friends. We're like all having a good time, and like you're like, don't. No one wants to rock the boat. No one wants to like make it into a big stink or something. We're like, can't we all let all of our egos get along and have a good time together and have some drinks and stuff, right? That kind of thing happens, and that kind of conversation just isn't going to get at the truth as much as one in which you don't have those kinds of ulterior motives, where there's not some other agenda or goal that people have in mind. So that's what's going on there with truth-seeking principle. Now, here's one that we're going to usually have quite a lot to talk about. The fallibility principle. This is the first one on the list, and it probably deserves being first just because of how important it is. Fallibility principle says that each participant in a discussion of a disputed issue should be willing to accept the fact that he or she is fallible, which means that one must acknowledge that one's own initial view may not be the most defensible position on the question. Now, I think the fallibility principle is not one that we're going to get a lot of disagreement about. I think this is one that if I ask you guys to like write your own code of intellectual conduct, I'd probably see something like this on each one of your lists. I don't imagine anything else. Because it's like, if you're going to be a truth seeker, you kind of have to recognize that possibility that you might not know anything. Like there might be some more seeking to do that you're not done with the seeking because you've got all the answers or something like that. But here's what I want to talk about. I mean, I think the principle itself is obvious, and I think everyone would bring it up. But I think there's some dimensions to it that also might fly under the radar. And I think there's, I might even say something a little stronger here. I think there's some common misconceptions about what it means to satisfy the fallibility principle. You might summarize the fallibility principle as saying, like, you got to be open-minded. You got to listen to what your opponents have to say. You have to not be closed-minded or dogmatic or arrogant. And that's all. Those are fair characterizations. But how do we recognize whether someone is closed-minded or open-minded? Sometimes I think we interpret something like confidence as really closed-mindedness, or conviction as closed-mindedness. That basically someone who's going to be open-minded is someone who's like, I don't know what to think. I can see it that way, I can't choose. That's what open-mindedness means. And I don't think that's really the case. I think that being open-minded, and certainly with the language that the fallibility principle is using, all that's really required here is that I be willing to entertain the possibility that I'm wrong. That basically means I have to listen to my opponents. I have to entertain criticism. That doesn't mean that I have to agree with it. It doesn't mean that I have to say, yeah, my opponents are right about something. They could be totally wrong, and I could still be satisfying the fallibility principle. If I say, and let's make a little drama about it. So I'm having a discussion with someone, and I say, here's what I think is true, and they say, no, I think you're wrong about that, and here's my objection. And it's a really weak objection. It's something that's just like barely even relevant, doesn't have a lot of support to it, something like that. I can say, I think that objection absolutely fails, and here's why. And I'm not violating the fallibility principle. I can say, I completely disagree with your position. And that's still, I listened to what they had to say, I entertained it, I can take it seriously. That's all that the fallibility principle is asking for. It can be pretty hard to tell whether someone is actually satisfying the fallibility principle, because this isn't going to be reflected in any of their overt behavior. I think that's why we sometimes latch on to these things, like whether someone is like coming out all strong and being like, I know what's right, I've got all these arguments, check out all my arguments, that we might think, oh, they must be a closed-minded person, because their behavior is something we can observe. It's something that we can like recognize or quantify or something like that. But really, the fallibility principle is about my willingness and my sincerity in entertaining the possibility that I'm wrong. And that's not something you get to really see directly. There are some behaviors that are less common if I'm insincere, or maybe less common if I am sincere. There's certain things I may do or not do because I am taking my opponent seriously. I mean, let's say if I say, I think your position is totally wrong, but I'm not going to say any reasons why. Like, I'm not going to defend that claim. that might be a sign of insincerity. Or if I start doing something like making personal attacks, that's a good indication that I'm not entertaining their criticism seriously. So I think that's something we have to be open to, or something we have to be careful about making judgments about. The accusation that someone is closed-minded, even if that's an accusation that you're just keeping to yourself, is a very, very scary one in terms of this whole project of trying to have productive intellectual debate. In my experience, about I don't know, I'm just gonna say something arbitrary, like 90%, most large majority of debates that I see like turn into something that's a really terrible, abusive, sort of like people yelling, fighting with each other sort of thing, which I'm sure all of you guys have some kind of contact with at some point in your life experience. Like the point at which things are going okay and then they go into the shitter is right at the point that one party or the other loses faith in the other person's sincerity, that they suspect that they're not arguing in good faith, that they have some ulterior motive, that maybe they're not concerned with the truth or something like that. Even if they're wrong in that accusation and that suspicion, that belief itself usually is what sends things south. If you're not trusting each other, then it's hard to keep the debate from being something that's going to degenerate into abuse. I think I mentioned to you guys that the more that I've taught the code of intellectual conduct, the more that I've become convinced that the sort of central idea for having the whole thing make sense is this kind of shifting of paradigms from like a debate being a competitive encounter to being a cooperative encounter. And certainly my willingness to entertain what my opponent has to say is definitely going to get reflected in whether I'm looking at it as competitive or cooperative. Now, if I'm just like, I like a fight, then okay, I'm interested in what my opponent has to say because I want to defeat him or something like that. But from a cooperative point of view, I'm going to be very interested in what my opponent has to say because they're the ones that are really able to help me the most in figuring out if my beliefs are wrong. I want to be able to know that. And they're going to help me the most than someone who just agrees with me. It's a person who disagrees with me that's really the most helpful in my pursuit of the truth. So that's another sort of reflection here for fallibility principle. But the core thing is just that I'm willing to entertain what they have to say. I don't have to agree with them, and I don't have to be like a whipple waffler or something. I can come to a debate and be like, okay, I'm definitely willing to hear what the other side has to say here. But I could be like, honestly, I can't see how anything compares with these arguments that I've thought of or encountered at some point. So that's a very important point to me. I like to emphasize it, and I wish I had you guys all in front of me so I could see whether this is making sense or not. Maybe the chat people can talk about it. I think this is a student trying to call me, so I'm going to take that and pause the recording once more. All right, I'm back on the recording, and I'm looking at some of the comments from the chat room here, and I wanted to bring out a couple things that are happening. Certainly, in terms of this code and taking a look at it, and remember, I sort of presented it to you guys this morning, or what I was framing it as like, you know, critical debate's difficult, and this code is going to be something that will support us in doing something that's difficult. I was talking with my business ethics students yesterday about this sort of theme, and if you think about like this cooperative competitive model, and think about if you've had that experience of maybe really intense debate where like you and somebody else like don't see eye to eye. You're very opposed perspectives here, but it's something that's cooperative. There's no ill will. It's like a pleasant experience. It might be like super fun, or there might be like a lot of joy in it, even though you guys disagree so much. But it's probably, if you've had those experiences, it's probably with people that you really, really, really trust. People that are like really close to you, like friends, family, people who you know aren't gonna like freak out on you and start doing personal attacks or like do all this other crazy crap. The things that are that makes things more difficult than they need to be. Sorry, I got a lot of coffee here. So my business ethics class, as you can imagine, business ethics, a lot of politics, a lot of economics going on in there. Those debates can get pretty heated pretty fast, and there's such divisive opinions about how we should run society, what should businesses be expected to do and what they shouldn't be expected to do. How's the government supposed to be involved in business? I mean, there's a lot of polarized conflict. And I realized when I was talking to them yesterday, man, sorry, I'm gonna have to get some more water. Um, I realized when I was talking to them yesterday that I'm really asking them, and inviting this kind of critical debate to happen in class. I'm inviting them to treat total strangers as if they're people that they have really close, trusting relationships with. And that's kind of a ridiculous expectation. I mean, that's not something that's like easy to do. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that. That's part of what this code is supposed to help us with, is to like give us some kind of platform of support to try to enter into that really scary place. Now, I do think there are some things that help. Like one, that in the grand scheme of things, there's pretty much no consequences if people in the class think you're stupid or disagree with you or whatever. Like, it's college. This is like the safest time ever for throwing yourself out there with your beliefs and stuff like that. That might help a little bit. But also, practice is what's going to really be a part of this. And that's what, Alexa, you were saying in the comments here, that like, you kind of internalize the stuff. Just getting the principles is not just, like I tell you the principles in this lecture. You take a look at the document. That's not going to be enough to like make, it's not a magic wand I can wave around, this code of intellectual conduct, and it makes everyone love each other and have cooperative debate with each other. I mean, this is not, that's an unrealistic expectation too, but it's something that I want us to kind of shoot for. The more that people can like take some risks in class, and other people and me and sort of the class as a collective community can show itself to be trustworthy, then we can do even more. We can like have more space where people can be more vulnerable. People can, you know, put their necks out there even more and make for an even better debate. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Let's head back to the principles here and talk about a few more of them. Okay, so the fallibility principle and the truth-seeking principle are both principles that sort of govern how we're approaching the debate. But now we're going to start talking about the principles that govern what we're supposed to do in the middle of the debate. And let's start with the clarity principle here. Clarity principle says that the formulations of all positions, defenses, and attacks should be free of any kind of linguistic confusion and clearly separated from other positions or issues. Now, this also might sound pretty familiar. That, like, you know, every English class you probably ever have taken, or communications class or something, is all about, like, how do you communicate more clearly? Arguing, debate is a conversational activity. You're going to be communicating with each other if you're having a debate. So do that effectively. Communicate your ideas effectively. Now, that's all well and good. That's like something we should definitely try to do. If we're going to try to get at the truth, if we're not speaking clearly, that's going to get in the way. But there's another hidden dimension of this that has to do with this whole switching from a competitive to cooperative model, and being a sincere truth seeker, and inviting criticism, and loving your opponent, and all that wonderful stuff. One other big reason that I want to be clear is if I'm not clear, then we have to spend a lot of time in the debate trying to understand what I'm saying, instead of using that time and those resources to figure out, to evaluate my idea, or whether we actually think it's true or false. That's like the main purpose that I'm here for. If I'm going to be in the debate and I'm going to put my ideas out there, that's because I want them tested. I want to see if they're really right. I want to see what opponents can throw at them and see whether they can stand up against that kind of criticism, whether they can hold water. And the more that we have to kind of spend all this time clarifying my ideas, there's less time and resources for actually evaluating their merits. And that's really what we're here to do. This is another example of, there's another great example from politicians here, who are like purposefully ambiguous or unclear so they can kind of avoid accountability. Sometimes academics, I think, are maybe a little subject to that criticism. They're vulnerable to that objection as well. Sometimes there is such a thing as being like overly intellectual, of like making things more complicated than they need to be in order to kind of avoid making yourself vulnerable to criticism. So that's another reason that we want to be clear. So it makes it easier for our ideas to be attacked. And that's a good thing. We want that. It's not like we're going to come up with really weak positions so that we can be objected to or something like that. But we do want to make it as easy on our opponent as possible to evaluate what we're saying, to figure out whether it's really true or whether it's not true. So that's what's going on there. That's some of the extra stuff I want to add or cash out from the clarity principle. All right, let's talk about burden of proof and charity. Now, these two principles, they kind of go hand in hand. I think that they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Let me read them for you, and then I'll kind of give you my shortened versions of it. Burden of proof principle says this. The burden of proof for any position usually rests on the participant who sets forth the position. If and when an opponent asks, the proponent should provide an argument for that position. Bottom line here, take responsibility for your own contributions to the discussion. You make a claim, you have to defend it. It's your job to defend why it belongs on the table of the debate, not your opponent's job to justify why it should be taken off the debate. Okay? And I got a couple things I want to say about that burden of proof principle. This whole idea of taking responsibility for your own contributions. I just want to point out to you, I think that principle kind of reads off the page. If you make a claim, you should be expected to defend it. The burden of proof is on you to defend why it's true, not on your opponent who wants to say that it's false, it contradicts you. What I want to point out, or observation I want to bring to your attention about this principle, is that it goes against I think the natural social momentum, the rhetorical momentum when we're just talking to each other on the street everyday sort of situations, like maybe non-philosophical sort of situations. That if you're talking with some people, it's like the onus is really on the person who wants to rock the boat, who wants to like contradict what's being said and tacitly accept it. It's kind of like innocent until proven guilty. That's kind of how we normally operate. If someone doesn't say anything, someone makes a claim in a discussion, no one says anything, then it's sort of like that belief kind of got like tacitly accepted by the whole group for the purposes of the conversation. Someone might even pause, like, wait, they're like, okay, no objections, all right, then moving on, I can say something else. I want to build from there. Even if that acceptance isn't actually happening by the group or the people that are in that conversation, it sort of has that kind of momentum to it. And what the burden of proof principle is saying that's backwards. It shouldn't be, the onus shouldn't be on your opponent to have to like raise a stink about this and decide like, is it worth it? Do I want to contradict them in this debate and like make a big deal out of it or not? Really, it should be expected that the person who's making the claims needs to defend them. So this is more like a kind of guilty until proven innocent principle. We don't have innocent until proven guilty. We have guilty until proven innocent philosophy, or at least in pursuing the truth with reason. Okay, so that's burden of proof. Man, my nose is so itchy. Principle of charity is kind of the flip side of the burden of proof. If the burden of proof principle is saying take responsibility for your own contributions, then the principle of charity is actually telling you to take responsibility for your opponent's contributions to the debate. Let's look at the wording here from the principle itself, and then I'll talk about it a little bit more. Principle of charity says, if a participant's argument is reformulated by an opponent, it should be carefully expressed in its strongest possible version that's consistent with what is believed to be the original intention of the arguer. If there is any question about that intention or about any implicit part of the argument, the arguer should be given the benefit of the doubt in the reformulation and or, when possible, given the opportunity to amend it. Okay, now that's a lot of language here for an idea that's really simple. As it's stated literally, the charity principle is saying when you're going to talk about the ideas of your opponents in a debate, you're going to say like, some people disagree with me. They say this, that, or the other thing. Whenever you're kind of sharing their ideas, you want to present them in the strongest possible light. Don't purposefully present them in the weakest possible light. That's what the principle of charity is saying. Imagine it like this. You've got your position over here. You hold some kind of belief and imagine there's people that agree with you. You've got like a little camp, a little family of perspectives that are kind of on the same page here. And then you have the enemy camp over here. They're opposed. There's a lot of opponents. There's a bunch of people who disagree with your position, your sort of general belief. Now, if I want to try to engage with my opponents here, I could just try to pick out the weaklings, the ones that are like really easy to attack, instead of the strongest possible advocates or representatives of that whole family of opponents. Again, this is something you see in politics all the time. When people are having political debates, they don't pick like the smartest, most intelligent, most reasonable, most like charismatic, best track record sort of representatives of the opposing camp. They choose the people that make the stupidest claims, that say the stupidest things, that make the biggest mistakes. Those are the people that they draw the attention to. That's violating the principle of charity. When you're trying to engage with your opponent, you should be painting them in the best possible light, not the worst possible light. You want to square off against the strongest opponents, not the really weak ones. Maybe you've heard of the straw man fallacy before, and that's the charity is the antidote to straw man. Straw man fallacy is when you purposefully misrepresent your opponent as having a weaker position than they actually have to make it easier to attack them. So you're like, it's like a smear campaign in a debate. You're like purposefully kind of painting them in a worse light than their position actually has, in order to make it easier to dismiss them. Now, straw man can also happen even when there's an opponent that's not already present. So I can do things like I can bring up opponents that are really weak. It's not like I'm sitting right here and having a conversation with somebody else or having a debate, and then they say something, and then I bring it up again, and then I purposefully kind of twist it to make it sound weaker. It might just be that I'm just talking to you right now, and I'm like, some people disagree with me, and they say this, that, and these other stupid things. And obviously, isn't that crazy? And then you're like, yeah, that's crazy. And then that could also be straw man. That's another way in which you're basically facing off against the weakest possible opposition rather than the strongest possible opposition. And that's something we want to avoid. Charity is the positive, the do what you should do charity, rather than what you should not do, which is straw man argumentation. Now, this is one of the principles that I want to amend, because I don't like the language here that's in the code. I'm going to bring it up on the screen again here for those of you who are watching the video after the live lecture part here. Or if you're following along, those people who are in the chat forum, if you're following along on the code, take a look at it again. Notice how the principle of charity is only talking about what happens when you're reformulating the argument of an opponent in the debate that you're having. I don't think we have to wait to just that moment in order to start thinking about how to put our opponent in the best possible light. Here's another scenario you can try to imagine. So I'm having it, actually, let me do it as a metaphor first, with something that's a competitive activity. So imagine we're playing chess. I haven't played chess in a while now, but maybe you haven't played chess either, but maybe kind of the basic idea. It's a board game. It requires a lot of thinking. There's a lot of like moves and counter moves, and you're trying to like plan ahead, like moves into the future, plan for all the things your opponent can do to you. I'm not that great at chess. A lot of philosophers are really good at chess, and they all seem to be better than me. So maybe I'm somewhat good. I don't know. Maybe they're just crazy good. Anyway, it's very often that when I'm playing chess, I make a move, and I'm waiting for my opponent to take their move, and then I'm like, oh man, that was a bad move. I just left myself totally open to attack. Like, I made this move, and now my opponent can just destroy me. And I'm just like sitting there being like, I sure hope they don't see that. I hope they don't see that opening that I made, that I just like left myself totally vulnerable to be demolished. I just hope they don't spot that and don't act on it. In a competitive game, that's going to be my attitude. Okay, now imagine it in a debate. If I'm like in the middle of a debate and I'm defending my side and engaging with my opponent, we're arguing back and forth, and I think of some argument that they could use to just totally destroy my position, and I'm just like, hope they don't think of that one. I hope that one doesn't come up. I'm going to hide that away, maybe divert attention away from that, the ideas that might lead them to that argument or objection. That would be totally inappropriate. If the purpose is to get at the truth, I'm basically like hiding something that's like totally relevant for evaluating whether what I'm saying is true or false. So it's totally wrong to do that. So if you think of something that your opponent could use against you, bring it up. The principle of charity is also about that. And I think also, if we're following the spirit of this principle here, that maybe it would also extend to a principle that tells us that we should take some time, just like we take time, we spend reflective time thinking about how to defend our own beliefs and perspectives. What if we spent some time trying to come up with arguments, like positively brainstorming, actively brainstorming arguments that our opponents could use against us? That is also something that I think the principle of charity is asking us to do. That's another responsibility that we have as sincere participants in a rational debate. So that's something I'd advocate for, that we sort of expand this notion of charity a little bit more. I really think charity is, I can talk about charity for hours. Charity is something really, really special on the code. I think it's, if I was going to say that like the core of the code, probably the truth-seeking principle. That's kind of the thing that holds everything together. If we're not trying to get at the truth, then pretty much nothing else in the code really matters. That provides the context for the whole thing. But if the truth-seeking principle is the core of the code, I think that charity is the soul of the code. That's what I like to say here. That it's the soul of the code. Why? Well, the reason is that if we're comparing someone, if I'm imagining like being sincere at seeking the truth versus being insincere and having some kind of ulterior motive, like I want to win the debate. If I want to win, the last thing I'm going to do is give my opponent more ammunition to use against me. If I'm seeking the truth, then I want to do everything in my power to try to help my opponent challenge my position, to test my beliefs, to see whether they really hold water, whether they're really justified, whether they really deserve for me to endorse them and authorize them and adopt them and use them in my life as guiding principles. I mean, if I'm truth seeking, I'm going to use charity. If I've got this ulterior motive where I just want to win, don't really care about the truth, then I'm not going to use charity. So what does this mean? It means that if you're trying to convince your opponent that you're sincere, like going back to like the fallibility principle, like you want to prove that you're like open-minded, that you are willing to entertain criticism, that you are arguing in good faith and all that sort of stuff, one of the best things that you can do to demonstrate your sincerity is to use charity. Is to like give your opponent arguments to use against you, to like help them out on their side. Like you can make an objection to their position and then help them defend against your own objection. When you're making those kinds of moves, that speaks volumes about what your investment is in the debate and what you're in it for. That you're not just in it to shoot people down or feel powerful and strong and smart, or to like just win or whatever, right? Whatever those other ulterior motives are. When you use charity, that really sends a message. I found oftentimes because this whole because so much of the time debate and arguing turns into fighting, we kind of generally get gun shy about debate. We're like, I don't know if I want to do this sort of thing. Oh, someone's coming at me with this like critical debate energy. I'm like, I kind of start the debate defensive. I'm already like diving in my little foxhole and like, you gonna attack me? Like, what are you gonna say next, right? Like, you're already like just braced for the person to start abusing you, right? Or for things to start to get heated and crazy. And oftentimes, people, I think, when they do they use like bullshit argumentative methods or get abusive or something, it's kind of like a preemptive attack. They're just kind of braced waiting for you to do it, so they're going to hit you first or something like that. And I found that you don't have to like write them off immediately. Sometimes you have some patience with it and like show things like charity. You show that you're like sincere. Maybe even talk about some of the ideas that are like embodied here on the Code of Intellectual Conduct. Then sometimes people can like relax their guard. They'll be like, "Oh, okay, you're not a crazy fucking person who's gonna abuse me and hurt me and all that sort of stuff." And they're like the bad argumentative practices can just be dropped
Yo,
when it seems
hello.
like there isn't any kind of like need for them to happen. when you're not going to use them against them, then they might drop it. Like, I'm like, here, see, I'm going to put my gun down. Then they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to put my gun down too. So that's a little. I've seen that happen a lot of times in my life. I have a discussion with someone, and I'm like anticipating it's not going to go well. They're not being very charitable. They're not like, really stepping out there. Hey,
Tim.
what? I'm going to pause for a second. All
Uh,
right, sorry for that interruption, everybody. I think you guys get the picture now at this point here about what's going on with charity, why I think it's so crucial and important, all the work that it can do for you, and this whole why it's the soul of the code. I'm going to take a little break here to give you the secret code for this lecture. The secret code is chocolate. Chocolate will be the code this time. There's some chocolate on my table. We'll make it chocolate. It's not always going to be food. I mean, but tonight it's chocolate. All right. So there's the code. All right. We're definitely going to have to stop real soon here because we're getting to an hour. We're past an hour actually. For those of you who've been with me since 8 o'clock, thank you. I'll talk about a couple more things here really quickly, like the structural principle here on the code. There's not a whole lot to this. Well, actually, I should say that a little differently. The structural principle has actually a ton of stuff going on with it, but it's kind of like the placeholder in the Code of Intellectual Conduct for all the standards of logic, whether we're talking about formal or informal logic. Philosophy department at BC offers classes that you can study formal and informal logic. Formal logic's kind of it's like the formal structure of thought and truth and claims at all. The kind of stuff that's like absolute and necessary that can't be that is not really fallible. Like for instance, take process of elimination. Let's say I know there are only two possibilities. And then I learn that one of these possibilities is not true. Then I can conclude with necessity that the other thing is the case. There's only, like for example here, I got this, here's a dice. I'm going to put this dice in one of my hands. So I'm going to tell you, you know, and you can take this for granted. The dice is either in my left hand or my right hand. It's not my left hand. Therefore, it has to be. There's no option other than for it to be in my right hand. That's a little bit of logic right there. The only way that argument can fail is if one of the premises is false. Either the dice is not in, it's not in either hand, or this one actually had the dice in it. Then it's not in the right hand, right? So if you want to talk to me more about logic, I'm happy to do that. But that's formal logic. Informal logic is like just all the other structural standards that would apply to arguments based on the type of argument that it is. So if I'm arguing from authority, or whether I'm doing an argument from analogy, or I'm making a inference the best explanation, or I'm using statistics, like a statistical generalization as a part of my argument, those different types of arguments will be held to different evaluative standards of just whether they're like the right type of, or the right a good argument of that type. That's what these informal standards are like. Also things like the fallacies like straw manning and ad hominem, these like personal attacks. Those are argumentative mistakes that informal logic trades. It's basically all of the standards of whether an argument is a good argument or a bad argument that isn't covered by the formal logic stuff. And really this structural principle here, it's just trying to address that kind of stuff. There is something that is worth mentioning, though, and that's this circular reasoning component to it, of having a conclusion that assumes, or an argument that assumes the truth of its conclusion. This is called question begging. And maybe you've heard of this phrase, question begging, or begging the question. The phrase begging the question especially has just gotten horribly misused by most English speakers. It has nothing to do with like raising a question. It's not like, oh, and usually we say it like, and that begs the question that blankety blank. You hear that a lot on like the newscasters or something like that. Like that begs the question. It's really not about how it raises the question. Begging the question is making a circular argument. That the way that I'm like offering premises or evidence or reasons to justify a conclusion that I'm trying to assert, whether my argument assumes, like it only works as an argument if my conclusion is already accepted as true. And that is a problem. That doesn't get our argument anywhere. That's just circular reasoning. It's like saying, I'm right. Why? Well, because I'm right. That's like really what it comes down to. Here's a little example of a question begging argument that isn't quite as blunt as it's true because it's true, or I'm right because I'm right, or something like that. Take this. Let's say, and I'm not particularly trying to pick on religious types here. I actually, I don't know if I've already told you, I usually put my cards out on the table. I am religious myself. I count myself about equal parts Lutheran and Buddhist. So I'm not trying to like rag on religion here. Although there's plenty of examples of bad reasoning that happens in religion as well as outside of religion. But so it's kind of an even thing. But this example is too good to use, so I'm going to use it. Imagine I'm trying to convince you that God exists. Saying God exists. Why? Well, here's my argument for it. It says in the Bible that God exists, and the Bible's the inspired word of God, so you know it's true. That argument's not going to convince anybody, or at least not anyone who doesn't already agree with the conclusion. Because in order for the Bible to be an authority based on that it's the word of God, that assumes that God already exists. So if it's supposed to be used as an argument for proving that God exists, it's not doing an effective job of that. This is something that I think is a very natural mistake that we make, this kind of question begging thing. Because usually we're just like, well, here's my perspective, and this is, let me show you the world of the logic of the perspective that I'm operating from. And that's all fair and good for like sharing what your position is, but that doesn't make any argument for why you should think it's true. In order to do that, you got to appeal to some kind of independent reasons, some other kind of like neutral considerations that people on both sides of the debate can acknowledge. Another good example of something that's often cited as like question begging argument that is even more subtle is take something like the abortion debate. Whether you are pro-life, pro-choice, or whether you basically, I hate those terms. Those terms are not so great. But whether you think that abortion is morally permissible, whether it's okay to do it, or morally impermissible, that it's like not okay to get an abortion, regardless of what side you're on, there's like the common argument you always hear from either side usually has to do with whether or not the fetus is a person. And by calling it a person, we mean a kind of moral category. A person that would have like a right, persons have moral rights. If I'm a person, I have things like a right to life. And that's usually what the debate comes down to. People who think that abortion is morally impermissible are going to argue that the fetus is a person with a right to life. And people who think that abortion is morally permissible argue that the fetus is not a person, so it doesn't have a right to life. So it's not doing anything wrong to kill it. Whether or not the fetus is a person is one of those claims that's so tightly connected with the position or the perspective that it's supposed to defend that it might not be one of these kind of independent, neutral reasons that both sides can acknowledge. And those are the kinds of arguments you'd want to have. There's some, if you take my ethics class, we'll do a little abortion in that class. And the philosophers that we read have some amazing arguments to defend their position that don't play into that usual game. That they work really hard to come up with arguments that are really working with the core beliefs of their opponent's position. They're not just preaching to the choir. They're not just making arguments that have to do with people who already agree with their side. But they're looking at the beliefs of their opponents and working with that. It's like instead of playing a home game, you're playing an away game. I like that sort of metaphor for it. So that's worth pointing out here about the structural principle, this whole question begging phenomenon. I'll probably talk about question begging many times this quarter. That's something that happens all the time. Even when philosophers are trying really hard to be responsible and not beg the question, they can still be guilty of it. So that's something you always want to be kind of keeping an eye on. Is there some way that the person is defending their position in a way that takes their position for granted as already being established as true? So that's what's going on there. I think I want to call it a night here. We've got the relevance principle, the acceptability principle, sufficiency principle, rebuttal principle, suspension of judgment, and resolution. I think I'm going to, like I was talking about this morning, make a second video lecture for the Code of Intellectual Conduct, and we'll finish off the rest of them then. So hope this has been interesting. It's definitely going much more in depth on a page-and-a-half document. So I hope you've enjoyed it. So there you go. I'll see you guys next time, and I will turn off the recording.